What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about people who call themselves polyglots online and why they should really stop doing this. So I see a lot of these videos all the time where people go out and record themselves speaking in a language and having just the most basic interaction with a person and watching them absolutely flip out with excitement that they speak their language, right? This ranges from more common languages like Spanish, French, or Chinese to more obscure ones that pop up, that people bring up, right? And honestly, these videos to the people who don't know what they're looking at seem really impressive because they're able to have these very stuttery, very basic conversations, and people freak out and are amazed, and it looks really good on camera. But if you're actually paying attention to it, they're really not saying that much. A lot of these videos are subtitled so they have what they're talking about, right? These conversations are not good. They're not even a fluent conversation. They're essentially just a script that people have built up, and they're going through and using this same script over and over again and catching different people who are then surprised by their language skills. I'm thinking specifically of two people, Xiaoman, something or other, NYC, something like that. And then there's a Dutch guy who floats around and does this. I think the Dutch guy's a little bit better, to be quite honest, but Coulter, something like that. He's definitely a little bit better. He's able to have some pretty decent conversations in a lot of the languages he says that he can speak, right? But I still don't think that he's fluent enough to get away with calling himself a polyglot. And now I'm going to tell you why I think that is, why I think the CEFR scale kind of sucks, and how I look at learning languages instead to make it more applicable to real life. So for me, when I think of a polyglot, and sure, I've said I'm a polyglot, but not really. If somebody pushed me on that, I would say that definitely not, right? But I do it for the marketing value, right? For me, a polyglot is somebody who's able to hold good, fluent, high-level conversations on a range of topics in at least 4 languages, right? For me, right now, that's definitely English and Spanish, and maybe I could sneak French in there. I feel pretty confident with French. It would take me some time to think of words at certain occasions, but I'm able to have conversations on most topics and engage in conversation and speak, right? I make my errors, that's fine, but I'm able to have the conversation, right? But I still don't think that counts as polyglot because it's only 3, so maybe I could claim trilingual, right? But my Portuguese, my German, my Arabic, my Italian is not good enough for me to technically, in my true opinion, qualify myself as a polyglot. All these people who are recording all these reaction videos, all they're doing is talking about where they're from, why they're learning whatever language, what they do. They talk about their hobbies, right? That for me is a very basic level of Spanish or any language that is achievable after just a few months of study, right? And honestly, once you've learned a bunch of languages like that, you could probably get to that level in a couple of weeks by just knowing a handful of scripts. You can go out and record your videos. You make a big buzz and blow up on the internet, but you're not really having conversations, right? And if it got outside of that basic conversation, they're going to be just as lost as you are, right? Now, I'm in no way saying that we need to speak as if we're like college professors in all of these languages, but you should be able to have a very good, fluent conversation on pretty much any topic that comes up that is within your ability to answer, right? I'm not an engineer. If engineering comes up, whether it's in English, Spanish, or Chinese, I'm not going to be able to follow it, right? Same thing with probably like art history, right? Not something that I'm hugely interested in, but therefore I'm not going to be able to follow along with that conversation or contribute much, right? But even in languages where I have a lesser ability, I can still engage in conversation and talk about everyday life and hobbies, right? But even then, that's like a very intermediate level traveler Spanish, right? So let me talk to you about what I mean by traveler Spanish. So to me, there's a few levels, right? There's the survival Spanish level. This is the most basic, right? We can say like, hello, good morning, I want, right? You can basically order food at a restaurant and that's about it, right? Now, once we get to like the tourist level of a language, this is where we can handle most situations we're going to see in day-to-day life, simple exchanges, right? Nothing too in-depth, but we're able to navigate things like going to the restaurant, going to a market, going shopping, getting directions, maybe checking into a hotel, getting through an airport, things like that, right? It's purely transactional. I'm trying to get something out of this situation. Here's my very clear defined goal. And once I run out of my very limited vocab, I'm not going to be able to continue the conversation. I just don't have the grammar knowledge. I don't have the vocabulary. to go beyond much more than like, hi, I'm here to check in, give me this, you need that, where do I go? Basic interactions. Then there is the second level for me, which is the traveler level of Spanish, right? Anybody who has traveled for a long time has met these people. They can have a pretty good conversation, introduce themselves, they can ask about the place they're in, they can ask about what people like to do, what they've liked in the place, right? Tell about some stories that have happened to them recently in a very simple, limited way. In the Spanish, that would be just purely with the preterite, right? This for me is around the A2 to B1 level-ish on the current scale, right? You don't have perfect grammar, you don't have a ton of vocabulary, but you have enough to get through a good exchange and get to know somebody and really form a connection with that person, right? For me, this is kind of, I would place my Arabic, or it's getting to this level to where I can have pretty basic interactions, get to know people, ask them what they've liked about this place, ask about where I should eat, right? Really engage in more in-depth conversation than that just purely transactional tourist level of a language, right? Which is kind of my Italian, right? I can get through the situation, but I'm not going to go very far. After this is like fluent, right? You're able to have a pretty decent conversation about most things that you should feasibly know how to talk about, and be able to go into a like in-depth conversation about things you're interested in. Like maybe that's surf or jujitsu, right? This is also known as like bar stool test, right? Can me and you sit down at a pub with a glass of beer and have a pretty good conversation where it's not too much of a strain for any of the parties, right? At this point, you're able to read books, you can consume media in the language, right? Follow along with like podcasts, radio, and understand the vast majority of what is being said, and you're able to hold conversations without too much problem, right? You'll make your errors, that's fine, it's bound to happen, but for the most part, it's not a struggle for anybody to communicate, either for you listening to the other person and you speaking to the other person for them to be able to understand you, right? I would say that this is where my French and Portuguese at. I can pretty much have any conversation about most normal topics. My French is probably better than my Portuguese, but they're about the same, right? And I can talk about most of the things I would want to talk about in a normal day in these languages, right? Maybe once I start getting into like tougher topics, like it might be hard to kind of talk about architecture or talk about history a little bit, right? But for the most part, I'll be able to, right? Of course, my Portuguese, specifically my French to a lesser extent, benefits from the level of Spanish I already have, right? Making it so that if I don't know a word, I can kind of on Spanish to an extent to come up with that word, specifically in Portuguese and lesser so in French, right? For me, this like fluent level is basically what like middle schooler is, right? Where they're able to talk about their day, they're talking about their hobbies, what they like to do, right? But the like thinking and like higher level skills are not quite there just yet. After this level, I didn't quite know what to say or call it, but I'm gonna go ahead and call it like school level in a language, fluency, right? So at this level, you're starting to be able to handle more complex topics. You're getting into maybe like more in-depth science, maybe some psychology. Maybe you're able to talk about philosophy in a limited way, right? You're entering into these more advanced topics, but you're not necessarily knowing all the words to be able to have just 100% fluent conversation. You might still need to pause to find the right word or to make sure you're correct, but your conversations are engaging and you can express your thoughts clearly. After this is where you can start to get into like level fluency, which is for most people the ultimate goal, right? Although I don't necessarily think it should be the ultimate goal for most people. I think most people should be aiming more for that like fluent middle school level skill or ability in a language, right? Native level fluency is where you're able to express yourself almost on the level of a native speaker, right? Or even at a native level speaker after you've been there for a few years, right? You're fluent in slang, you know, idioms, you understand cultural references, which is huge, right? And you can dive into pretty much any conversation without breaking a sweat. Again, if it's not a topic you're familiar with, like engineering, you're probably still going to be quiet. But now even things like philosophy or politics, government, things like that, world events are going to become much easier to handle. Now, I really don't think that you can get to this level without living abroad. You have to live abroad because you have to come to grips with the slang, you have to come to grips with idioms, cultural references. There's a lot of things that people talk about that don't make sense just purely translating it, right? You have to get the culture and context behind it, which you just can't get unless you actually move abroad. So real fast, let's touch on that idea of the bar stool test, right? For me, I think it's fair to call that you're fluent in a language, and if you wanted to, you could use that as a barrier for polyglotness, right? when you can pass this bar stool test. Meaning you can sit at a bar, have a conversation pretty decently about a lot of things, right? That goes beyond just the like, are you, where are you from, how long have you been here, what do you like about here, what do you do in your free time, kind of thing, right? We can have better conversations on more things, right? And for me, my French and Portuguese definitely pass this test. I can sit down and have a conversation with most people about most things and not really struggle too much, right? I might have to ask in Portuguese specifically for them to slow down a little bit, but having the conversation, I would be able to do that. And maybe even on a good day, if I'd studied for a couple weeks, I could get my German to this level, maybe a month, right? For me, this is the point. Once you can hit this point, you're like a good level of fluency to where you can kind of back on the language, right? And start to learn through using real life things. You can start to do more enjoyable activities like watching movies, reading books, listening to podcasts, engaging with the radio, right? Essentially incorporating the language into your real life. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about how long I think that it takes to get to each of these levels of like Spanish, tourist Spanish, Spanish, and then middle school, high school, and like level, college level fluency. Right? So the like level Spanish of like the basic direction, ordering a coffee and ordering something in a restaurant, I think you can get that in about 2 weeks, to be quite honest, if you just sit down and study it. All you're doing at this point is just memorizing a bunch of phrases. You're not really expected to respond back to anything they say. You're not going to understand most of what they say. You're just trying to get things out so that you can make things happen, right? You're essentially a baby at this point. You're 2 years old. You're able to say, me want milk, and you're able to get out of the situation what you want. After this, we get tourist level Spanish. Here you're able to do most basic daily things pretty confidently, right? You can go to the market, you can go do some shopping, check into a hotel, maybe navigate the airport, right? Talk about you yourself, right? Where you're from, what you like to do, what maybe even your plans are going forward. I'd say that you hit this level somewhere around the 2-month mark, right? About 8 weeks worth of study, and you can pretty confidently be at this level, right? So that means if you've got a trip coming up, and obviously this varies a little depending on the language you're trying to learn, but 2 months out, if you got a trip in August, you can start studying that language in June, right? And you'll be okay to navigate life and feel pretty confident with yourself, right? That you're not going to get lost, that you're not going to get taken advantage of, things like that. Right? Then that like level of Spanish, I think that comes around 4-ish months, right? Maybe 5, maybe 3, depending on how many languages you've learned before, how good you are at it, what language you're learning now. Like Arabic is going to take a little longer than trying to learn like Italian, right? Especially coming from a Spanish background. So at this point, we've kind of asked the basics. We're getting into pretty fluent conversations. We're able to talk about what we did in a week or last month or last night, right? We can recount stories in a simple way, even things far back in the past. We can talk about things that happened in our youth, kind of our general biography as a person, right? We're using the past tenses. We're starting to write stories, right? We're starting to work together even in writing those 2 past tenses of like preterite and imperfect in Spanish, things like that. Then that like dual middle school level Spanish, that like B2, which is where you can talk about most things without much of a problem, right? You're probably not perfect yet, but that's okay. You're going to make a few mistakes, but it's not anything that's going to cause them to be confused about what you're saying. You can understand complex topics that are familiar to you, and pretty much any basic topic you're feeling pretty confident with, right? I think you reach this level at somewhere between 6 to 12 months. Again, depending on the difficulty of the language, how many languages you've learned before, just how much study you're putting into it. Now, there is a key difference between this like level of fluency and anything else, the high school level or that like level college graduate fluency level, right? I don't think you can make it past that like B2 barstool middle school level Spanish or any language without spending significant time abroad, right? Whether that is traveling or actually living abroad, right? Now, I think you can travel and and with that practice, get to the high school level of Spanish, like that C1-ish area, right? You're able to have in-depth conversations about almost anything. You might not always get everything right, but you're very confident and comfortable with talking about most things: science, literature, history, psychology, whatever you're interested in. You're able to pretty easily follow along conversations, especially one-to-one. You're getting into feel confident to follow along on group conversations. You understand jokes when they're being told, and you catch some cultural references that you have seen in your real life, right? And for me, to get to this level, you need at least 6 months abroad, right? Whether that's multiple trips abroad to travel and practice, whether that is going and living abroad for a long period of time, doing the digital nomad thing like I'm doing, right? You got to go abroad. in order to get to this like school level Spanish, that's C1, right? And then that like level fluency, college graduate, true level of like absolutely dominate this language. I have multiple synonyms for different words. I understand very complex and rich language. I could read I'm reading Borges right now. You can eloquently express yourself on pretty much any topic that you would feel comfortable talking about in English, right? You understand slang, you understand plays on words, you understand cultural references that people are making, right? But to really hit this level, I think that you got to spend at least 2 years abroad, right? Don't really think I hit this like C2 level until after my trip to Spain, which had been preceded by 4 stints abroad already. Time in the Dominican Republic, spent 2 weeks there, so not too much time, but enough to practice. And then I was also studying Spanish in college, so I was involved in it all day. But even when I moved to a different country, I moved to Mexico, that cost me probably 6 to 12 months in readapting myself to learn their slang, to understand the cultural references, to understand the play of words, which Mexicans love, right? So just because you speak that level doesn't mean that if you go abroad, you're going to feel as confident, right? Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for listening to me rant a little bit on people calling themselves a polyglot. I think it's dumb. Unless you're willing to like post of you having a conversation with a native speaker and you're able to pass that, I'll give it to you even the barstool test, right? Where you're making some mistakes, but you're able to have a pretty fluent conversation. Then you can start calling yourself a polyglot, right? But if you're just posting videos of yourself saying a few phrases and catching people being like, oh my gosh, you speak Chinese, just stop, okay? And I hope now with that a little bit of explanation of like my Spanish or language learning, right? It helps you to make it feel a little bit more or real life, help it make it a little easier to gauge what level you're at and kind of what you should be doing or what you need to do or how much time you need to put in order to get to that next level. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you're interested in joining a Spanish class, be sure to send me a message using some of the contact information in my bio. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day. Leave anything you want me to do in the future down below, and I'll see you in the next video.